the Zoom, and then we'll get started shortly. Thank you so much for joining. All right, I think we're good to go. Let me just hit record and take it away.
Sorry, Mickey, my recording voice chimed in. Did you say take it away?
Yes, go for it.
All right. So thanks to everybody who was able to join us today. Some of you may have been on the Zoom with Keith Lindsay last week. So to the extent that you were able to tune in for that whole discussion, some of this information might be somewhat repetitive, but I think it's always good to have multiple perspectives, even if we're addressing the same question. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce myself and introduce Bob Jacobs, our expert who is with us today. And then Bob and I are going to run through a number of questions, and then ultimately we will open the floor up for any questions that the audience members may have. So my name is Jake Davis. I'm a staff attorney with the Non-Human Rights Project, and I am zooming in from Denver, Colorado. Today we're joined by Dr. Bob Jacobs, who's a neuroscience professor at Colorado College with more than 30 years experience in neuroanatomy. His work began in 1984 when he began his dissertation research in the laboratory of Dr. Arnold B. Scheibel at the UCLA Brain Research Institute. He has 44 peer-reviewed publications to name, all in well-respected scientific journals. He also has 2 chapters in edited volumes, 63 professional talks presented at academic conferences, and over 60 invited lectures about the brain. From 1984 to 2010, his main research focus was on the human cerebral cortex, specifically on the quantitative neuromorphology in the cerebral cortex, that is, the shape and size of nerve cells, in other words, neurons, in the outmost layers of the brain involved in higher cognitive functions. He also has 18 publications focused on human tissue. From 2010 onward, Dr. Jacobs focused on comparative neuroanatomy, examining the brains of a variety of species. For many of these species, his studies constitute the first time anyone has explored the neurons in the brains of these animals. Some of the species he examined included African elephant, giraffe, minke whale, humpback whale, bottlenose dolphin, Siberian tiger, clouded leopard, Florida manatee, cheetah, African leopard, chimpanzee, African wild dog, domestic dog, banded mongoose, caracals, zebras, wildebeest, pygmy hippos, greater kudus, ring-tailed lemurs, golden lion, chacma baboons, macaque, Flemish giant rabbits, Bennett's wallaby, and Long Evans rat. So quite a number of different species. He has a total of 18 publications focused on these non-human animals. Dr. Jacobs, perhaps most importantly, is also an expert in our case on behalf of elephants of Machli, Nawalzi, and Basmusi, who are imprisoned at the Fresno Chaffee Zoo. And so my first question to Bob would be, Bob, why did you start researching elephant brains?
I don't know. It was an odd series of separate coincidences and serendipity that led me to actually investigate the elephant brain, which was the first species I did outside of humans. It had to do with collaborations with colleagues and people knowing other people, and they came along at the right time after Paul Manger had perfused 3 elephant brains, making it possible to do detailed neural studies on those brains. And I was able to get those. I'd long had an interest in cognitive ethology, or the behavior of animals in their natural habitat. And I developed a course in that area. Joyce Poole was influential in my readings and career. So I just somehow everything fell into place at once, and I got the tissue from the elephant brain and we stained it and looked at it, and then realized we were in a completely different world because nobody had looked at the elephant cortex before. In fact, this behind me is a stain of the elephant cortex. It's very different from other mammals. And so it took a while for us to try to figure out what was going on, what was different, what was similar. And that long list of animals you read off, the elephant brain still remains the most different in a lot of ways. So that's how it began. And just went from there looking at other species after that.
And so you said something interesting there. You said the elephant brain was different than a number of the other species that I mentioned. Could you describe a little bit what those differences entail?
Well, there's a neuron that's dominant in the cortex. It's called a pyramidal neuron. And it has a different shape in the elephant brain than it does in other mammals. There's a dendritic branch that goes up towards the surface. And in most mammals, there's a single branch, and it bifurcates a little bit at the cortical surface. The elephant one has usually two branches that go up, and they spread very widely. And so what you see in the elephant is very large neurons that are spread out quite a bit laterally, suggesting that they receive a lot of connections from other neurons. And there's must be some differences in processing. Now, the overall length of the dendrites means branches. And the significance of that is the more branches a dendrite has, it's like branches of a tree. The more branches a tree has, the more leaves a tree has, the more photosynthesis you will get. Or the roots of a tree, the more nutrients you can sample. So in a neuron, the more surface area you have, the greater length and number of dendrites, the more information that neuron can process. So these neurons obviously are sampling very widely and can process a wide variety of information. One of the interesting points was to compare these neurons to those in humans, and the overall length of the branches is about the same, but in neurons, they're much more compact and they're much more branchy. But in elephants, they're less compact and the dendrites go over very long distances. So anatomically, that's one of the main differences. Now, what that actually means is subject to speculation. Joyce Poole and I have talked about this a fair amount. And we think it goes along with the idea that the elephant is a fairly contemplative animal. It has the size and the time to analyze its environment and think about its environment, whereas primates like humans tend to respond very quickly to things. And that may be tied to this morphology, we're not sure, so it's purely speculation.
Well, that's great information, thank you. And so one of my questions that I was going to ask was a little more about the specifics of the work you do when you have the brain or the brain particles in front of you, but I think you answered that to an extent. What I was hoping to get to was whether or not you use a control when you're studying the elephant brain, and you mentioned that you do use human brain. So outside of the dendrites, would you be able to speak to any more similarities between the human brain or any more similarities of the human brain as far as the elephant brain's functioning goes? In other words, what are some, layman comments you could make explaining how the human brain and the elephant brain work in this similar way?
Well, the elephant brain is, of course, much larger, about 3 times larger than the human brain. Of course, this scales up with body size proportionately. There's a couple of unique things about the elephant brain. One, the size of the cerebellum, which we typically think is involved with coordination of muscles. And in humans and primates, we see a fairly large cerebellum, and we always associate that with manual dexterity that we have using our hands and so on. But it becomes more complex than that because the largest relative size of the cerebellum, and actually absolute size, is in the elephant, followed by dolphins. And dolphins don't have hands to manipulate things. So that the question is, why do they have a large cerebellum? Elephants have a trunk, of course, which can manipulate things in very fine detail, but that isn't the whole story. So the cerebellum is also involved in positioning our body to interface with the environment. And one thing that you see that's in common with elephants and cetaceans like dolphins is the auditory world is very important. Dolphins use echolocation and their whole body as a receptive surface for echolocation signals. Elephants, of course, use what we refer to as infrasound, low frequency sounds that we can't hear to communicate over several kilometers so they can keep in touch with each other. And they receive a lot of that information through their feet, which has a lot of specialized receptors for vibrations. So the cerebellum in the elephant not only controls the trunk, but it also helps the animal interface with the world and all the other sensory modalities that are used. So that's one main difference between the elephant and other species is the size of the cerebellum. The other thing that sticks out in the elephant is the size of the olfactory bulbs. In humans, the olfactory bulbs used for smelling are about the size of a Q-tip. And frankly, that's not very impressive compared to other species. In a bear or a dog, depending on the size, the olfactory bulb is about the size of a finger or a thumb. In the elephant, the olfactory bulb is the size of the palm of your hand.
Wow. And
so when you see elephants lifting their trunk up like a periscope, they really are bringing in a lot of information. And it's extremely sensitive. There was one study that I'm still impressed by. They gave elephants two samples. One was a coffee can, a quarter filled with coffee grounds. Another one was a coffee can, say 3/4 filled with coffee grounds. Elephants could determine the difference. They could tell you which one was a quarter full and which one was 3/4 full. We don't have that ability. So it's extremely important for them, the olfactory world.
That's great, thanks. And we're gonna come back to some of this science that we just discussed later in the discussion, but I think right now let's just take a step back, and for our audience, if you don't mind, maybe you could just describe what a typical day looks like for an adult African elephant in the wild.
It's a day filled with variety, I would say. The females tend to travel in large matrilineal herds of related families and close kinship and friendships, if you will. And they interact with each other in quite complex ways. The leader, of course, is the oldest female, typically, the matriarch, she's called. And they will travel over long distances foraging, and it's long distances over a diverse terrain. Typically, they'll travel, depending on the season, the amount of food available, 5 to 10, 12 kilometers in a day would be a pretty average number. But if they need to, they'll travel over 50 kilometers a day. Without Uber, without Lyft, without taxis, and so on. And a lot of that time is spent foraging, of course. They tend to eat quite a bit. But what's interesting is the different things that they forage. There's over 100 different plants that they will typically eat, depending on the season. So the diet is really quite varied for them. The males, there will be young males in this group, but the older males tend to break off and travel. Originally, it was thought they traveled in isolation and didn't really interact. But in fact, the males have their own social interactions with each other too, with the younger males learning a great deal from the older males who are able to sexually reproduce. So the males also have a complex social life as well. So I would, and if you look at Joyce Pool, as long as there's available food sources, elephants also have enough time to be silly. So they can play in the water and do what Joyce Pool calls silly things. They tend to be pretty entertaining when they want to be.
And for our audience members who may not know who Joyce Poole is, she is fortunately one of our affiants in our habeas corpus cases that we bring on behalf of elephants, including the case we are bringing in Fresno. She's a authoritative figure in the world of elephant cognition, and people have described her as the Jane Goodall of elephants. So she is a force in that world. And Bob, you've had the privilege of interacting with her, and so that's great. So based on everything that you just said, it sounds like the physical needs of elephants include space, diversity in landscape, diversity in foliage, excuse me, and some aspect of a social dynamic, a herd or a friend or a partner. And that brings me to the next question, which is, based on all of those things you just described, and including the specifics of elephants you described, such as their hearing, their sense of smell, what they do with their feet and how their feet register sensations, do you think that US zoos are able to meet the complex physical and psychological needs of elephants?
No.
And why is that? Because of everything that was just mentioned, they don't have the ability to provide the space, the stimulus, the herd's dynamic?
Yeah, there's all sorts of problems there. Well, by the way, if I say anything that contradicts Keith Lindsay, go with what he said, if you would. He is really one of the world's experts on elephants. The main, or there are several, but I would say the main limitation for zoos is simply space. They cannot provide tens, hundreds, thousands of square kilometers of space for elephants. And that, of course, is one of the problems for elephants in their natural habitat too. As natural habitat disappears, their lifestyle changes as well when they can't go to the normal places they would go. So one, there's no zoo that can even come close to providing the amount of space that elephants need. Second, the food variety and the terrain variety, they can't provide either. In zoos, one of the problems for elephants that's pervasive are foot problems and arthritis in the feet, because they are typically forced to live on hard surfaces, concrete or packed dirt, and that's about it. Whereas in the natural habitat, they go across a large variety of terrains. Second, the variety of food. And in zoos, most of the time they get hay. Of course, they'll have carrots and other vegetables thrown at them for their trainers when their trainers want them to do something. They may get some browse once in a while, a tree branch or so, but otherwise the main diet for them is probably hay, which again doesn't come close to the variety in the natural habitat. And then the social needs are woefully lacking. For one reason, it's hard to keep a lot of elephants in a small space, and they fill up the space fairly quickly. Elephants have particular trouble housing male elephants, especially African elephants, because they tend to be much larger. They also go through must, which makes them, when they're sexually active, and they become fairly aggressive at that point. So it's very hard for them to take care of or to keep male elephants. So usually they'll keep 2 or 3 adult females who are not related, and their offspring until elephants are shipped off to another zoo or something like that. So in all 3 areas, space, food, terrain, and social needs, zoos are just woefully lacking, with no chance of, despite whatever efforts they make, they simply can't meet those needs.
So in our legal filings, we ask for the courts to release our clients to sanctuary because in most instances, they unfortunately can't be returned to their home country, whether that's because they don't have the skills to survive because they were taken when they were young or because they're older and ailing. in your estimation, do the two accredited sanctuaries in the United States, the Tennessee Elephant Sanctuary and the Performing Animal Welfare Society in California, do those facilities provide adequate space for an elephant to live a life as close to nature intended as is possible in this country? Do you think there is anything that could be done to improve those spaces, or what is your take just generally on sanctuary?
The difference between sanctuaries and zoos is that zoos are designed for people. Sanctuaries are designed for, well, elephant sanctuaries are designed for elephants. And so everything about them is different. The main difference, of course, is the sanctuaries tend to be fairly large, tend to have a pretty large natural habitat for them. It's not the same as their native habitat in Africa or in Asia, but it's still much better than what zoos provide. They also interact with each other. One thing you'll see, I've seen at Paws Sanctuary in Northern California, is the elephants interact with each other. If you look at elephants in a zoo, they're so bored that they don't even bother to interact with each other half the time too. They'll just walk independent of each other with very little social interaction. In the same way that if you and I were put in a cabin for a year, I guarantee we wouldn't get along. And it would be your fault.
I believe it.
So you know, the sanctuaries are, I think, a decent option. And for many of these elephants, the only option if you want them to have any semblance of a normal existence.
So the zoo might push back on comments about, you know, their facilities versus sanctuaries and arguing that they play a critical role in the conservation of the species. Some of our audience members might be familiar with this anecdote from the call with Keith Lindsay, but in 2016, the US imported 17 elephants from an African country claiming they otherwise would have been culled. But part of that importation was also an argument on behalf of conservation, ambassador species, ambassador animals, if you will. And so my question to you would be, did this import, or does the housing of elephants in zoos in general, does that play a role in conservation when it comes to elephants in the wild?
No, it plays no role at all. It's the catch. One of the catchphrases for zoos is to say that if zoos are important for conservation, then the question is, why are Asian and African elephants again endangered species? Zoos have done nothing to help in terms of conservation, as far as I can tell. No animals are returned to the natural habitat, and that does happen with some species, like the black-footed ferret, for example, but it doesn't happen with elephants. And the reason that zoos import elephants is that the reproductive success of elephants in zoos is extremely poor. And so elephants will die out in zoos if they don't bring in elephants, if they don't import elephants. And so it's simply not true. There is, as far as I can tell, no conservational benefit. And Reese has pointed out in a book on elephant captivity, if you want to spend money wisely to conserve elephants or help elephants, take the millions of dollars that each zoo spends on elephants each year and use that to preserve native habitat for those elephants who are free. The amount of money that zoos spend to keep elephants is extraordinary, mainly because as what's called a charismatic megafauna, elephants bring in money. Most people don't go to a zoo to see a frog, no offense to frogs, but they go to see elephants and other large mammals typically. So the conservation argument is nonsense, I would say.
Yeah, the taking of money that zoos generate and putting that into the wild without bringing those wild animals in to put behind bars seems like a logical way to help preserve these natural habitats. So, you know, outside of the corporate system and the mega donor system, if an individual wanted to try and help conserve the elephants that are currently in the wild, absent supporting organizations like the NhRP who are trying to move zoo elephants into sanctuary, what can they do, if you know, to help support wild elephants?
Reduce the number of humans would probably be the main thing, because the main threat to elephants in their natural habitat is humans. One, because of poaching, which kills a huge number of elephants every year. And two, because of the loss of habitat. With humans, the human population growing, them taking over more and more of the land, just like for many species, the loss of natural habitat is a major issue. So we have to have preserves that have to be very large for these elephants to continue to have a semblance of their normal life, because they have an evolutionary history of traveling hundreds or thousands of miles a year, looking for food sources, water sources, and so on. And the problem is, of course, now they come into contact with human settlements when they do that. So this is the everlasting problem for elephants and for other species as well, as the human taking over of the earth in many ways.
Sure, and correct me if I'm wrong, but elephants have ancient migratory paths that they have been following for generations, paths that they've been using since before human encroachment in these specific areas. So, for an elephant to follow a migratory path to access water or food or mates and come upon a human, it's, what's the alternative for them? This is what they've always known. The human just got there. So it is an issue that is being addressed in some places, but certainly needs to be addressed at a larger scale. Let's switch gears again a little bit and talk about our specific clients at the Fresno Zoo. The importation I mentioned in 2016 that brought in 17 elephants from Africa included two of our clients, mother-daughter pair, Mahi and Nawalzi. And so I wanted to ask you, what is life like for those two, as well as Busmusi, who is the third elephant who shares the enclosure with him in Fresno?
Well, I watched several of the videos that you provided. I don't know if people listening have seen those as well. I would say they're bored out of their minds, frankly. I'm not sure what is the size of the exhibit there. Do you know?
I do not. Perhaps Courtney knows. I do not know off the top of my head what the size is, but it is small. Let's just say that.
There's very little for them to do. They do have, it appears, a water hole. Elephants don't use water as much as we sometimes think they do. One of the reasons for a water hole is to have mud to protect their skin. They have some green covering on the ground, but it looks like they're foraging from a putting green, basically trying to pick up any semblance of a blade of grass. And certainly they're not going to get really enough to eat there by browsing. There doesn't seem to be much else. There's some rocks there, some dirt that's hard packed. And I'm guessing when they come out of, if they stay in the barn at night and come out into the open during the day, within 10 or 15 minutes, they've seen everything there is to see in that enclosure. And then they've got the rest of the day to do whatever they do. Sometimes zoos will provide what they call enrichment for elephants by putting hay in hidden places and stuff like that. But the elephants learn very quickly where the food is and where to go. So it really isn't much of a form of enrichment for them. So 15 minutes of the day, they wander around, and then the rest of the time, I guess they're trying to figure out some way of entertaining themselves. They look like they're bored out of their minds to me.
I imagine humans.
Sorry, Jake, just to chime in, but Courtney messaged me and she said it's 3.5 acres.
Okay, which is nothing compared to 100 square kilometers or 1,000 square kilometers. My friend Lester O'Brien likened it to a human family living in a bathroom for their entire life. And we also know from the last 2 years of the pandemic how humans respond to being closed in. We're not very good at it. But for elephants in a zoo, they've got decades to live under those conditions.
Yeah, it's truly terrible. And I just want to add one small anecdote before I get into my next question for our audience members. Bob and I actually visited a zoo recently that we are going to be suing in order to hopefully free the elephants that inhabit space there. I'm not at liberty to say which zoo specifically, but something I noticed there, as well as in the videos and the pictures I've seen from Fresno, is that all the natural plant life is actually surrounded by wire. Whether it's electrified or not is a little unclear, but the elephants can't even access the bit of true plant life that is in their enclosure. They're forced to only interact with the grass, as Bob mentioned, and the hay. And so that adds another component to their existence that I would think is exceedingly frustrating. Which brings me to my question, which is, based on everything we've discussed, it becomes clear, but I feel the need to ask to clarify again, what physical and psychological damage are these elephants suffering by being in this enclosure for decades on end?
First, let me say for the zoo that we visited, it wasn't too long ago that they updated their elephant enclosure and made it better than it was before. But one of the things that I learned by going there with you is it's much worse when you see it in person than when you see videos or you read about it or something like that. I was actually fairly shocked as to how bad it was for seeing it in person, because I don't go to zoos typically. I just find them too depressing. So it was actually much worse than I expected. So now back to the psychological and physical damage. We know the physical damage, the medical damage would be mostly in the feet, with arthritis, osteoporosis, damage to the feet. That's compounded by the fact that many of these animals are overweight and obese, and that puts extra stress on the feet. So that's one thing physically. They also can have dietary issues and dental issues as well because of the lack of variety in their diet. When we talk about psychological damage, of course, I'm a neuroscientist, so for me, psychological damage and physical damage are really the same thing. And what you see invariably in captive elephants, especially in circuses, but also temple elephants that are often chained for 20 hours a day. And I think probably in most captive elephants in zoos is some form of stereotypy. So it's a repetitive movement that serves no apparent purpose. So in elephants, it would be rocking back and forth, which often you will see, touching things repeatedly with their trunk for no clear reason. In the Fresno Zoo, you see one of the elephants, I think, have a strange movement with one of her hind legs that she keeps kicking out behind her. I haven't seen that in the literature as the type of stereotypy, but it did seem fairly odd to see that. Stereotypy, the thing to recognize is if you see stereotypy, that means there's damage or dysfunction at the neural level. And we recently published a paper talking about the effects of impoverishment, and that's equated with a captive environment, on the brains of non-human animals. And so it's pretty clear with elephants when they exhibit any form of stereotypy, certainly it's a psychological damage that you can see behavior, but it's also reflective of neural damage. There are things going on in the brain that lead to stereotypies. And that's been researched quite a bit, what the actual mechanisms are. I won't try to go into any detail on that here, but psychological damage is in fact neural damage as well.
And when Bob and I visited the zoo that can't be named at this time, there was an elephant who was exhibiting these stereotypies. It was swaying and bobbing, and there was a woman who grabbed her child and brought it over to the fence and said, "Look, honey, the elephant's doing its dance," and then started to mimic the elephant dance. And so I want to be clear on this point. The elephant was not engaged in anything remotely resembling joy or happiness. It was, in other words, its mind was deteriorating, and because of the lack of education around animals generally, but elephants too, a passerby could think that the elephant was actually happy or being playful.
The other thing that zoos will tell people is they will claim that their caregivers love the elephants and the elephants love them. And I really don't doubt that the caregivers care a great deal about the elephants. Whether the elephants love them or not, I'm not so sure. To me, it seems more like a case of Stockholm syndrome, where the elephants are simply held there. Their source of food is the caregivers. And so, yeah, they like the caregivers because that's their only source of food, really. But I bet if elephants were allowed to leave without external threats, they would probably do that. The only reason they're there is they don't have a choice.
Right. And I think that's a pretty good place to conclude my questions. Mickey, should I turn it back to you for audience questions?
Yeah, sure. So I'm going to open up the chat box. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to type them in now.
And while we wait, I'll just add one more question. So Bob, as mentioned, Mali and Nawalzi, they were captured from the wild and brought to the States. Do you feel that caused additional trauma for those two?
Well, yeah, it's not even a question, really. Of course it did. In the same way, if you imprison humans, it has an effect on them.
Sure.
So it really isn't much different from that, I think. And I will point out the study that we published, or the review that we published looking at the effects of an impoverished environment on the brain has been documented mostly in laboratory mice and rats, but in over 15 different species. In fact, any species that's been investigated, you see the same detrimental effects. Now, these studies haven't been done in elephants because the practical constraints and ethical constraints of doing such research. But unless the elephant is fundamentally different in terms of the fundamental neural properties, it also is suffering the same way as these other animals.
Thank you. There's a great question here from Nikita. She asked, does stereotypic behavior reverse once an elephant is rehabilitated in a sanctuary, or is the damage permanent?
There are different forms of environmental enrichment that are used to reduce stereotypies in captivity. And that's why some zoos stress that they're doing types of enrichment. And that's really to overcome the problem that they created by putting the elephant in that situation in the first place. So to a certain extent, yes. And we don't have any real data other than observational data that elephants, when they go to sanctuary, certainly the number of stereotypies, I think, tends to be reduced. Now, it depends on all sorts of factors. How long has the elephant exhibited these? What are the actual neural mechanisms and so on? But I would say in general, yes, stereotypies get reduced when they're put in a more natural environment.
That's great to hear. What about physical damage?
I assume that the foot problems will become less. They may not disappear. Once arthritis is there, I don't think it really goes away. But having a softer surface, for example, to walk on would certainly feel better to the elephant than walking on concrete. So I think it helps in some ways. Depends also on just how extreme the the medical conditions of the elephant are when they are released to a sanctuary. Just like the rest of us, they're not going to get any younger, and their health isn't going to get a whole lot better as they get older. So,
right. Thank you. So Vanessa asks, what standards do the sanctuaries follow to ensure the elephants are provided the proper care?
Just like zoos, they have good veterinary support there. And again, sanctuaries are designed for elephants. So a large space, elephants are not forced to interact with humans. They're not observed by humans on a moment by moment basis like they are in zoos. So they can actually get away from people. And they, of course, have adequate food and water resources and medical care. Probably a greater variety of food that they can actually forage naturally than what they would get in a zoo.
Okay. So I'm just reading through the questions. Great questions coming through. Considering zoos around the world are usually in city centers, how do the sounds of traffic, trains, metros, etc., impact captive elephants?
Elephants are very sensitive to their acoustic environment, especially low frequency sounds. And I saw a video recently of an elephant in a zoo who reacted in a very agitated manner to the sound of a loud truck going by. Low frequency vibrations from automobiles, from trains, and I think there's a train near the Fresno Zoo, if I'm correct, right, Jake?
That's right.
Yeah. Those will certainly be perceived by elephants. And there are studies on the damaging effects of what's called anthropocentric noise, human-caused noise for a variety of species, including elephants. And that's not to mention the sound of children screaming and so on right next to them for the whole time that the zoo is open. It's got to be disturbing, I would think, day in and day out in particular.
Yeah, absolutely. Even in the Bronx Zoo, when I visited, you could hardly hear each other. So I can't imagine what it's like for the animals, for the elephants. Okay, so Bruce asks, how do we recognize olfactory cognitive neuronal development as opposed to visual neuronal development, and how much of the intelligence is derived from glandular secretions? A lot of big words there.
What was the first part? How do we what?
Recognize olfactory cognitive neuronal development.
I'm not sure what the word recognize here means. There have been studies to look at the different sensory systems in different animals, and certainly in the elephant, a lot of studies on the olfactory system to know, how sensitive it is and what they can distinguish using olfaction. The visual system in elephants, their vision is pretty good, but it doesn't seem to be the dominant sense necessarily. I would say hearing, the auditory sense, which has a tactile component, and olfaction are really very important for elephants in particular. There are maps of brains that are done. For example, in dolphins, we know for them, the dominant sense is the auditory world. And their auditory cortex is much more complex than what we see in humans, for example. I'm not sure if that answers the question, but I did use a few words there. So,
thank you. And Kim asks, Bob, have you done any field observations in Asia or Africa in elephants' natural environments?
No. I wish I could. Jake fulfilled one of my bucket lists by going to Africa himself. I have not ever been able to do that. And that's why Keith Lindsay and Joyce Poole, when it comes to elephant behavior, are really the people you should listen to.
Right. And Bob, just to piggyback off that question, just because one is not able to experience elephants in the field, does that mean they're less an authority on, what happens to elephants in captivity in the States? Does that, make their credentials not as strong as another individual who might be able to make it to the field? How does someone that isn't engaged in the science on a day-to-day basis reconcile that distinction?
I would say to a certain extent, sure. I mean, if I'm with Joyce Poole looking at elephant behavior, either in captivity or in the natural habitat, I will defer to her. And when it comes to the elephant brain, though, she defers to me because that's what I've focused on. I would also defer to Keith Lindsay when it comes to captive elephants as well. I have learned a great deal in the last few years as we've written papers on this and read the literature, but that doesn't, I would not try to compete with those people who've lived, like Joyce Poole's lived with elephants her entire life. She knows more about elephant behavior than I ever will.
Right. She knows more about behavior, but perhaps if it comes to what happens to the brain of an elephant in captivity, she might reference your work.
Yeah, on her webpage, I helped her write the part of the webpage about the brain. So, yeah, I mean, we all have different specialties and they overlap.
Sure.
But yeah, that's normal in science, I think.
Yeah, and that actually leads me to another question asked on our social media. So as you know, our client Happy has been held in captivity alone for 16 years. What effects would long-term isolation have on an elephant's brain?
The same effects that you would see on a human in solitary confinement for decades. You get elements of depression and the neurochemical changes that go along with that. You get elements of post-traumatic stress disorder. All the changes that you would see in a human put in isolation, you would probably see in an elephant as well. And this is how much brains are similar. If you take social insects like social ants and you put them in social isolation, it changes part of their brain. It's part of their brain shows detrimental effects when put under those conditions. That's for an insect. And so for an animal with a complex social environment like an elephant, you can imagine the detrimental effect being perhaps much greater. Brains are different in every species, but the basic mechanisms are very evolutionarily conserved across species.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. So let me see another question here. Why is this information not getting to the public, and what can we do to spread this message?
Well, I think it's getting out, and the information is getting out. We see it with changes, for example, to SeaWorld after the documentary Blackfish. So there are some changes taking place, but I think it has to be a generational shift. My generation isn't going to see a huge number of changes, I think, but my daughter's generation hopefully will start to see those changes. I don't think my daughter would go to a zoo, whereas I, as a kid, was happy to go to a zoo. The question is, humans aren't very good about treating other humans well as a species. So it's an uphill battle to try to get humans to care about a non-human species. That's the kind of the negative side of the coin there. It's an uphill battle, I think. But I do feel like there's a generational shift. I don't think this Zoom seminar would have existed 40 years ago. Well, Zoom didn't exist, so I can guarantee that. But people are talking about these things, and people are aware of these things more now than they used to be. but it is a long-term process, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Something interesting, a friend of mine actually said they have a toddler now, and he said, where else are my kids going to learn about elephants and other animals? And I think we make an argument quite a bit about, dinosaurs. Kids love dinosaurs. They know everything about dinosaurs, yet they've never seen one in real life.
Mm-hmm.
But then his rebuttal was, but kids get over dinosaurs. So I wonder what your thoughts on that were.
I think there's certainly, well, if you see an elephant in a zoo, are you really looking at an elephant anymore? Or are you looking at a caricature or an artifact of the elephant? It's certainly not the normal behavior of an elephant. The body looks pretty much the same, but it really isn't an elephant as you see it, and Jake could attest to this, having just gone to Africa. It's really not the same at all. And certainly, if you want, there are lots of documentaries. You can go on webcams and look at elephants in Amboseli in their natural habitat, and it's a very different creature, I think. So, are we learning a lot about elephants by seeing them in zoos? I'm not so sure. Or are we learning what humans have done to these elephants so that they really don't represent the species anymore? So that would be my answer. I would rather watch a webcam of elephants in Africa than go to the zoo.
Yeah, no, that's a really good answer. And Jake was mentioning earlier too, how different the elephants he saw were compared to those in the zoo.
Right. It was a special experience, but even for those who are unable to make it to Africa, which is obviously a big lift, webcams or even YouTube provide great videos of wild elephants interacting in ways that you will never see in zoos, crossing rivers, moving with other species, perhaps engaged in fights, eating and playing, rolling in mud, wallowing, being with their young, which we have so few of in the States, because as Bob mentioned, elephant reproductivity drops significantly once elephants get to zoos. So even if you can't make it abroad, videos on YouTube or webcams are a great way to learn about any species.
Yeah, absolutely. So Aaron asks, how many elephants have been released to sanctuary from zoos?
Jake, you would probably know better than me on that.
And I would defer to Courtney on this, so hopefully she can provide an answer. But I believe Paul's has just under a dozen elephants, and the Tennessee Elephant Sanctuary has just over a dozen. So, I mean, it doesn't seem like a lot, but when you take into consideration that at the turn of the 20th century, there were about 5 million elephants in Africa, and today there are only about 400,000. I mean, every elephant matters. And so, even if it's just getting one out every few years, it's still worth the effort, because these elephants deserve freedom and they deserve to live life as nature intended, whether it's in a sanctuary or in their home.
Right. Okay. So I
want to go back.
Oh yeah.
Part of the reason we don't have more elephants in sanctuaries is that zoos are, and we saw this with the case of Happy, of course, zoos are very reluctant to give up their elephants, although a lot of zoos have voluntarily stopped the elephant exhibit, probably because it was too expensive for them to meet the minimum standards. So zoos are very reluctant to give up their elephants because it's one of their main sources of income. If they were willing, then I know the sanctuaries would be certainly happy to take them.
Right. Yeah, so I think we have time for a couple more questions. So let me take a look. Is there a difference in the brain size and composition of captive bred elephants versus wild caught captive elephants?
Don't know, and that's where we get to the practical and ethical limitations of these kinds of studies. Only 3 elephant brains have been perfused, which allows detailed or fixed right away which allows detailed analysis of the brain. To do that study, you would have to have 10 elephants from a zoo and 10 elephants from their natural habitat. You'd have to kill them and look at their brains, and it would take years and years to do that. And that's why research, like the impoverishment research that's done on rats, you can't do with elephants. Or you wouldn't want to do it with elephants. And there's just too many variables to control under such situations. So we can only answer that question through extrapolation from the studies that we have, because you can't do those studies, I think.
Got it. That's interesting. Is there any kind of common like speculations on that question? Oh, like, is there an answer that you can speculate?
Yeah, the review paper that we wrote addresses that, and it talks about all the changes you see in an impoverished rat or dog or cat or fish or whatever species. And there's no reason to think that you wouldn't see the same kinds of changes at the anatomical level, the neurochemical level, the neurofunctional level in elephants as well, and cetaceans, dolphins, and orca and so on as well. There's no reason to think that those brains behave any differently.
Got it. Interesting. Okay, I think final question. This one comes from our social media as well. What gives you hope for the future as far as elephants and our relationship with non-human animals?
I tend to be rather pessimistic, so I'm not sure I can answer this question. My hope is that, again, awareness is spreading, and that maybe my daughter's generation will be able to effect change that my generation hasn't been able to do. And certainly people like Jake, and then also the scientists. Every scientist who works with an animal, Joyce Poole, Jane Goodall, and so on, eventually they come around to conservation because they want to see these animals exist in their natural habitat. We're raising awareness, but again, I'm not completely confident that the human species is capable of taking care of the planet or of other species when we don't take care of our own planet or our own species very well sometimes. So that's rather negative, and you really shouldn't end it on such a negative note. But
well, I can jump in and try to provide a little more positivity, although I agree with much of what Bob just said. As Bob mentioned, over 30 zoos have closed their elephant exhibits. So there are less elephants in captivity today than there were years ago. So that is a positive trend. And as more zoos agree to close their elephant exhibits, it'll become a trend, perhaps fashionable, perhaps the next generation will want that in their zoos and will be more willing to visit zoos without elephants. And then secondly, I'd say that there are countries in Africa who had allowed big game hunting for decades and now don't allow any hunting whatsoever of any wildlife within their country's borders, like a Kenya, like a Rwanda, and populations have begun to grow, whether it's elephant or the mountain gorilla. And so those are really positive trends that are able to occur because events like this, like the Zoom seminar happening and bringing awareness to issues that these wild species are facing. So at home, we have closures, abroad, we have expansions. And I think that is a trend that is worth mentioning.
yeah, I know that other countries like Great Britain is discussing having a law that they won't keep captive elephants at all. Other countries have now prohibited captive cetaceans as well, like dolphins and orca. So yes, there are changes. I would just like to see more of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, Mickey, to jump in again, but I just wanted to say, as we close out, Bob, I don't know if you can see it, but in the chat, our supporters are thanking you. And it's just wanted to mention that you're getting a lot of love and support. So we very much appreciate you speaking with us today.
Oh my.
Yeah, thank you so much, Bob. And if anyone wanted to learn more about your work, where is the best place that they can do that?
they should call Jake at 55. Oh, no. My email address is bjacobs. So Bob, like Bob Jacobs, bjacobs at coloradocollege.edu. coloradocollege.edu. And I'd certainly be happy to forward our paper that I mentioned, our review paper. One of the interesting things about that review paper that I was shocked is that nobody until this has ever linked an impoverished environment and the effects of the brain to captivity being an impoverished environment and the effects on the brain. It seems like an obvious comparison, but nobody had ever made that comparison before, which I just find rather astronomical. But feel free to email me and I can try to answer questions.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I dropped my email in there as well, and we'll send that paper out as a follow-up. So thank you so much, Bob, and thank you, Jake. And thank you everyone who joined us today.
All right.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.